Thanks so much for that. So last on our list of speakers is Bryan Palmer from Trent. Bryan.
Thank you. Well, first I want to thank the students and former students of Leo who've organized this event and who invited me. I know how gratifying it is for a supervisor to have students do these kinds of things for you at certain points in your careers. So thank you very much for everything that you've done. Unlike everybody else on the panel, I was never a student of Leo's. But we all, of course, are students of Leo's. I think that's the point. And my own relationship with Leo goes back to the 70s and the kinds of writings like The State, but then with Don and Leo with the Ottawa Committee for Labor Action, where they invited me as a very young historian to talk about struggles for workers' control. I still remember speaking to that audience, which was probably larger than this one, I think. Those were the days. In any case, I am delighted and honored to be here. And I thought I would use the time I had to reflect on basically and muse about the question of how we approach class struggle. And I'm prone to simplistic answers to complex questions, so I'll provide, in some senses, a very simple answer that I'll then try to complicate. And that answer, and this reflects some of what John's just said, is to take the declarative statement of Frederick Jameson, who, in introducing his masterful commentary on method and practice in literary interpretation of texts, said, always historicize. For Jameson, this imperative marked out an orientation simultaneously critical and engaged, cognizant of the political context of the subject of study, as well as the utopian longing for transcendence, a politics of alternative that would acknowledge the long and tortuous path to the present, as well as the possibility of a different future. And this injunction to always historicize has, I think, been evident in all of Leo's work. It's part, I think, of a particular but radicalized Canadian political economy sensibility, which is as much historical as it is political, as it is economic. And whether Leo has been writing on social democracy and the Labor Party, or as in his early work, where Ralph Miliband was obviously of central importance, or working with Sam on global capitalism, this injunction to historicize has been central. And I think it's lent Leo's work a richness and a resonance, and it was always a part of, in Canada, the kind of 70s sort of articulation of new and radical possibilities in scholarship that working class historians and political economists and feminists were all engaged in, I think, working in tandem but in different milieux. So that project of always historicizing is central. I mean, history is determined so much not only of where we are, but of what we are. However, for all socialists, and certainly for Leo, the complication then becomes, once one is historicizing, how does one transcend history? How does one understand where we've come to be to get somewhere else, to get past that? And this was, in some senses, a premise of the young Marx, who's quoted by Leon Trotsky in The Revolution Betrayed as referring to the burden of history as, quote, all the old crap. This muck of the ages, which Marx understood as the kind of historical continuity that saddled humanity with so much in the way of class-orchestrated inhibitions to the breakthroughs necessary to humankind's liberation, is the history of hurt and nightmare that Jameson locates as the foundation of all great works of literature. Like Walter Benjamin, Jameson recognizes that history progresses, but that it does so always unevenly, with the most advanced achievements resting on the foundational violence of dispossession, expropriation, exploitation, and oppression. It's precisely for this reason that history's development within the class confines of its long stages, of which feudalism and capitalism are the most recent and widespread, is continuously threatened by descent into the abyss of barbarism. As Benjamin noted in his 1940 thesis on the philosophy of history, there has never been a document of culture which was not at one and the same time a document of barbarism. And the same could be said, again, of over a century and more of class struggles, whether they're Canadian or global, which have always been of great interest to Leo, and in which he has often participated. Now, as the working class is inured to the continuity of all the old crap, the intensity and rapidity of innovation within which bourgeois society steeps, all that's solid melts into air, becomes normalized, even as it takes its toll in a range of debilitating developments. Take, for instance, the impact of technological change on workers, a topic currently newsworthy to the extent that countless Canadians seem about to have the work they have been conducting taken on by machines. Self-teaching algorithms and robots are now poised to undertake labor that machines were incapable of doing a decade ago. And this seems a monumental change. Yet this kind of thing has been, in fact, a part of the ever-changing industrial landscape for centuries. It's just an intensification of an age-old process of displacement of the human from the labor process. What is most troubling, perhaps, in the current polls on technological change is that they suggest that while Canadians are anxiety-ridden about what they face in the future in terms of robotics, they have become acclimatized to being displaced by machines, accepting of automation's dislocations and the insecurities of the workplace. And of course, if we look at the history of the labor movement, it was not always thus. There have always been struggles around automation, around technology, from really the 18th century through to the present. So I want to use this opportunity to pay homage to Leo, to argue that amid the continuities of dispossession, exploitation, and oppression, it is critically important, as all of his work demonstrates, to keep the politics of alternative possibility alive. This, of course, happens fundamentally in struggles of the kind of struggles that Rosemary was talking about, but it's also central to our work as intellectuals, as academics, in terms of interpreting this process. Settling neither for mere description nor for a scholarship that abstains from insisting that history's long nightmare can be turned into the realization of utopian promise, in which the continuation of the old crap is overcome. For Marx and for Leo, the transcendence of this history is not just the seizure of power by one class in the name of a collective agenda, but also the remaking of humanity itself in the process. The revolution, said Marx, is necessary, therefore, not only because the ruling class cannot be overthrown in any other way, but also because the class overthrowing it can only in a revolution succeed in ridding itself of all the muck of ages and become fitted to found society anew. And such an approach, I would contend, is the only way to look at workers' struggles in ways that both understand how they happened in the past and point to the way that they can actually work through the future and change our present into something quite different. Now we know, I think, at this point, that a romanticized sense and sanitized sense of working class struggles is not an adequate foundation on which to build a rigorous and politically animated study of labor at the current conjuncture. As histories of women and racialized and other subordinate groups, and Rosemary again was talking about this, reveal, and much else has shown, it's necessary to study labor now and in the future in ways that are self-reflectively critical. Workers' struggles have always been simultaneously heroic and limited, battling capital and the state, to be sure, but often in ways that reproduce capital and the state, that validate the continuity of these agents of exploitation and oppression, rather than challenging, repudiating, overturning, and defeating them. Now, this is not the fault of the collective working class, for so much works to create this process of reproduction, or even of individuals, although we should never shy away from identifying the responsibility of social strata, even though those strata within which we work closely, such as the trade union bureaucracy or aristocracies of labor, that have all too often, especially in specific periods, played a defensive or even reactionary role, miring themselves complacently and self-servingly in all the muck of history, rather than fighting to wade out of it. Now, this demands, I think, and I'll come back to these terms, and I have a piece on Leo coming out in Studies in Political Economy that addresses this. This demands both audacity and sobriety. And again, as I said, I'll try to end with something like that. Now, our history is rich, and by that I mean the history of workers, the history of socialists, and examples of stands taken against the long continuities of oppression and exploitation. But it is also weighted down as well by compromises, accommodations, even outright capitulations to and embrace of a wide array of limiting social constraints and social and economic and political compromises. These labor struggles then must be assessed with appreciations of nuance, even with contradiction, in which the object of transcending historical constraint and limitation is brought to the forefront, as I think Leo has always done. Okay, since I have limited time, I'm gonna wing it from in the end, and hopefully that'll shorten things. I see too little of this going on in my area of historical writing. And I want to pay tribute to actually the York Department, to Leo, Greg, David McNally, and others. Because the people that I'm actually most attracted to now are not labor historians for the most part, who've abandoned a lot of what I saw as what Jameson might have called the political unconscious of a sort of revolutionary project of the 1970s. More and more labor historians are focused on resilience, not revolution. And what has kept, for me, a spark alive has been the kind of students that, Leo and Greg and David have been mentoring at York in the political economy field, which have been actually taking the whole, I think, project of this, what I would call this radicalizing project of understanding labor, and pushing it in new ways. And even our journal, Labor Le Travail, has recently, kind of developed a co-editorship of Joan Sangster and Charles Smith, a student of Leo's, that reflects, and our ties to Cowles and Stephanie are, I think, a reflection of this. So I see, in some senses, the historical project being invigorated from outside, if you will, but among a political economy contingent, which Leo has played a fundamental role in, that is fundamentally historicizing analysis and practice in the labor field. I want to then close with notions with these two terms of audacity and sobriety. Leo has studied the state primarily. He's never let class struggle blind him to the sort of to the all-powering nature of the structures of the state. Indeed, the work on the state is always fundamentally informed by class struggles. But studying the state has pressed him in certain sobering directions, understandably. We have not been victorious against the state has been victorious against us. I think for labor history, arguably, it could be stated, the pedagogically most important text to be written in working class history in the last 30 years is Leo's and Don's The Assault on Trade Union Freedoms, I say that because you can take that article, which first appeared in Labor Le Travail in 1984, or that small book, and you can turn it to students, and it resonates. You know, they can read that book in a way that so much of the labor history that I write might just go past them. So I'm very grateful for that book. And that book is a sobering book because it is a history of a defeat. So we will need, and I pride myself on being an unsober person. Although it's less and less difficult in my twilight years to make these claims. But Leo knows my past and knows some unsober moments, where we have often argued. But I've come to appreciate the necessity of the sobriety in Leo's analytics of historicizing the project of socialist possibility. And we will need that sobriety. We will also need audacity, and may there be less of that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists.